Hey, welcome back. It's no secret that maybe my favorite part of teaching history is the storytelling aspect of it. And today, I want to share with you another one of my favorite historical stories. It's the story of a Christian monk named Telemachus. Telemachus lived somewhere in Asia Minor, and he lived a very peaceful life. In fact, he was quite fond of gardening. He spent a lot of time in God's creation, in flowers and planting. And yet one day, he had a vision from God in which God told him to go to Rome. Telemachus had never been outside his own monastery, so this was a shock to him. But being the monk that he was and committed to the will of God, he willingly went. And when he arrived in Rome, the city seemed strange to him because there weren't as many people as he thought there would be. The city seemed relatively empty, and he did see that there were a few people there that were slowly moving in a certain direction. So naturally, he followed along with them. Well, as Telemachus followed the other people around him, he quickly found himself just outside of Rome's Colosseum, the stadium in which gladiatorial fights took place. And Telemachus followed the crowd out of curiosity to see what was going on inside. And to his horror, he saw people celebrating and cheering as men killed each other in the Colosseum. Telemachus was shocked. He had no idea how to respond. He had heard of the glory of Rome, but never did he think that this is what Rome glorified. So maybe it was a spark from God himself, or maybe it was just Telemachus' own horror. But Telemachus stood up and began shouting, "In the name of Christ, stop this thing!" And the people around him simply looked at him and figured he was crazy and ignored him. But he didn't stop. He continued to yell, "In the name of Christ, stop this thing!" Well, as the fellow fans around him began to shove him around, Telemachus made his way closer and closer to the battlefield itself, continuing to yell and scream about why they should stop. Until finally he was actually on the gladiatorial field and he was clutching one of the gladiators, begging him to stop fighting. Well, at this point, the fans thought that Telemachus was part of the show, that he was staged, that this was supposed to happen. So they all started chanting, "Kill him!" And as Telemachus continued to yell, "In the name of Christ, stop this thing," the gladiators turned towards him and brutally murdered him in front of a chanting audience. While some of this story might be a legend, we do know that weeks later, the Roman Emperor Honorius canceled all gladiatorial games within the Colosseum. And never again would gladiator fights be held there. Telemachus is one example of a martyr, an individual who was killed for their faith. Unfortunately for Christianity, martyrs were all too common in the Roman world. See, Christianity was not accepted in the Roman Empire for a variety of reasons. And yet, to the shock of Rome and everyone else in world history, through these circumstances, Christianity will grow into one of the most popular religions in the world. How? Simple. God's plan. Hit it. It's no secret that Christianity was not treated well in the Roman Empire. Most people know that. In fact, usually when you think of Christianity during the time of the Romans, you think of something like this. Yes, Christians often practiced their religion underground in the Roman Empire, even literally in catacombs like the one you just saw. But Christianity was intentionally an underground religion. We're going to talk about the reasons for that, as well as the reasons why the Roman Empire did not entirely accept Christianity today. And we'll also unpack how Christianity transformed itself into one of the most popular religions in the world, like that. But it's important to remember the religious context of the Roman Empire. Because of the massive size of the Roman Empire at this point, religiously, Rome was very diverse. And for the most part, the Romans, who were polytheists, just like the Greeks, accepted most religions, or at least tolerated them. Because they believed in many gods, they were open to other religions and allowed them to practice. But that doesn't mean they accepted all of them. Rome is also famous for having a large number of mystery cults and secret religions. Most of these were tolerated. Yet they were often harshly judged for not being truly Roman. And that's where Christianity comes into play. You see, to the Romans, Christians were very similar to Jews, and rightfully so. Christianity does stem from the original Jewish religion. But after the events of 60 and 70 AD, the Jews were not exactly in a good place in Roman history. Ever since the region of Judea had been conquered by the Roman Emperor Titus in 63 BC, the Jews had fought back and resisted Roman oppression. Radical Jews who militaristically fought back were called zealots, and they were a thorn in the side of the Roman Empire. The Jews believed that the Messiah would come to rescue them from Roman oppression. And the Romans were very aware of this, so they were on the lookout for different leaders who posed a threat to their rule. Jesus was an example of that, and even though most of the Jews didn't regard him as such, the Romans feared that Christians did, and that just like the Jewish people, the Christians would fight back under the leadership of Jesus. So in 66 AD, when the Jewish revolt takes place, the Romans are fearful that Christians were a part of this as well, or they might start their own revolt. It's one of the reasons Rome reacted as harshly as it did. Roman armies invaded Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and triggered the diaspora, widespread scattering of Jewish people throughout the world. So the Roman Empire often lumped the Jews and Christians together, and yet as the Jews scattered throughout the world, Christians began coming together because it was through this turmoil that Christianity was really starting to take hold. As we know, Christianity is centered on the belief in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, that he came into the world as a man and died for the sins of the world and rose again. Jesus truly was the Messiah, the one that the Old Testament and God had promised for centuries before, that he would come to take on the sins of all the world. And after his crucifixion, his following only grew, despite the fact he was not recognized by most Jews. Jesus' life and ministry emphasized God's love and forgiveness, as well as acts of service and glorification of God. But the Romans never looked into the details. They didn't know that Jesus was just a simple carpenter and a teacher. Rather, they saw him as a potential military leader and a threat to Roman stability. The Romans, the Christians, were just an offshoot cult of Judaism that was a threat to Roman expansion. It's for that reason that Christians were often met with violence from Romans and Roman rulers, leading to them living underground. Or at least, that's the traditional story you get in most history books and classes. But what if Christians were underground because they wanted to be? What if Christianity was an underground religion because they just didn't accept what the Roman Empire was? See, Christianity was not underground just because of the persecution. Christianity was underground because there was a difference in morality and lifestyle. Christians did not feel comfortable living in the Roman Empire at its height, and there are 4 reasons why. The first was that life was cheap in the Roman Empire. Violence seemed to be glorified. Whether it was the glorification of war in regards to the Roman legions and conquest, or the glorification in cheering for warfare in forms of gladiatorial games, life was cheap in the Roman Empire, and violence was a big part of society. The city of Rome had a very high homicide rate. Emperors often entertained themselves with prisoners being killed in front of them in different ways. And Rome even practiced abortion. Unwanted children were often thrown into a ditch outside the city of Rome. And it is here that we start to see the actions of Christians and the way they lived contrary to the Roman Empire, whether it's the story of Telemachus intervening in gladiatorial games, or the Christians who would go into those ditches and find those abandoned children and raise them as their own. But because of violence, Christians were not comfortable within the Roman Empire. Only the Roman Empire was extremely sexually immoral. It had a number of different social practices that were conceived as normal, but would be contrary to God's word. Not only was homosexuality also common in Rome, sexual relationships were not limited to a husband and a wife. It happened all throughout Roman society. Immorality is completely against what Christianity teaches, where sexual relations are between one man and one woman who are united in marriage. Roman society and structure also perpetuated a disrespect for women. While women did have more rights in Rome than any other place, women were often disrespected. Roman women were often at the mercy of their husbands, and this often resulted into physical harm, abuse, and sexual exploitation. Marriage wasn't valued as the union between one man and one woman that the Bible professes. So again, Christians would be very uncomfortable with that. And finally, Romans lived lavish lifestyles of excess. They were lives of waste. Roman society was extremely wasteful. People were selfish and spent so much money on themselves, on their clothes, on their food. It was common in Roman culture that you would have a massive feast, and during that feast you would walk over to a separate room and you would force yourself to throw up so that you could gorge yourself on even more food. These lives were lavish and they were gluttonous. People truly indulged in sins of the flesh. And yet, at the same time, Christians were called to treat their bodies with respect and to share what they had, all in an attempt to glorify God. So because of all these things, Christians felt that they had to be underground because their lifestyle was so different from the terrible morality that the Roman Empire promoted. They separated themselves to not be tempted. Through this separation, as well as the frequent persecution that took place, it didn't look good for Christianity. Yet somehow, this religion continued to grow, and it continued to spread. And as only God's plan can do, it used its enemy to spread. See, Rome's roads and waterways were the perfect vehicle for the gospel to spread. People could travel very easily through the Roman Empire, and Christian missionaries began doing so. Rome also brought a level of education to the world and the ability to understand common languages like Latin and Greek. This would allow early Christian writings to be spread throughout the world and understood. Maybe the most famous Christian missionary was Paul, who formerly persecuted Christians. He began traveling throughout the Roman world, and specifically Mesopotamia, setting up churches and frequently writing important letters to encourage them in the faith. The Apostle Peter, who's often considered to be the first pope, worked diligently to instill Christianity in Rome itself. And like many other missionaries, there was risk involved. In fact, Peter and Paul were both executed for their beliefs and work for Christianity. Yet Christianity continues to spread. But within that, it also spreads because it's pretty appealing. You see, Jesus welcomed everybody. Remember, this is the same guy who, as a rabbi, would go around and meet with tax collectors and prostitutes and criminals. No one was off limits for Jesus. His message of salvation is universal. It doesn't matter who you are or what you've done, you're saved because of what he did. No other religion offers anything near that. Remember what we talked about with Hinduism and Buddhism and all the crazy steps you have to take to reach salvation? Here it's a gift. Who doesn't want a gift? It's free. Peter, Paul, and other Christian missionaries also combine the ideas of Christianity with Greek philosophy in a way that Romans and so many people throughout this empire could understand it better. I also think there's value in understanding that Christianity spreads because it's true. It's God's message. It's Christ's gospel. Remember, that victory triumph. Not only is that an awesome message to hear, it's true. And the truth generally has a way of becoming known. And then shockingly, about 300 years after Christ's death, Christianity gets some assistance from the Roman Empire itself. In 312 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine claimed he had a vision from God. Regardless of if he actually had the vision or not, Constantine believed he had, and in reaction, he began following Christ. Constantine had the Greek cross, the Cairo, painted on every soldier's shield, and after a victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine believed he won because God allowed it. Constantine himself, now a Christian, like so many people in the Roman Empire, officially declared Christianity legalized in the Roman Empire in 313 AD with the Edict of Milan. Now Christianity was allowed to practice freely, without persecution. And this is truly a turning point in history. Not only was Christianity now free, it was truly the religion in the Roman Empire. In fact, 80 years later, the Roman Emperor Theodosius would declare that Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire. Christianity goes from being persecuted and hated to the official religion of the world's largest empire. Fire up the Drake, because it's God's plan. Christianity becomes a true part of Roman society and also a part of Roman government. The church itself continued to maintain many of the original Christian beliefs, including the duty and service that are so important in the early Christian world. But now there's an organized structure to it. It's here we see new traditions like Sunday worship, the continuation of sharing Holy Communion or the Lord's Supper. But as the church continued to get bigger, we see more churches around the world throughout the Roman Empire. And in order to govern them and keep them on the same page, priests would be appointed as bishops, heads of a specific area of Christians. And those areas would be called dioceses. And that's still intact within the Catholic Church today. And this seemed all well and good. However, over time, bishops began to struggle with who was actually in command. And since the Roman Empire is centered in Rome itself, the Bishop of Rome became looked to as the highest bishop. He became later known as the Pope. Other important Christian cities like Antioch and Alexandria also had important bishops as well, and there would be sort of a power struggle within the Christian church for who was truly the voice of God. These bishops in important cities were often called patriarchs. Yet within this we see different divisions in the church, not just about who is in authority, but also different interpretations of the Bible, the identity of Christ, and the purpose for the church. But it can't be overlooked that now the church is protected by the Roman Empire. Christianity has developed out of being this feared cult in the Roman Empire to part of the Roman Empire itself. Again, that truly was God's plan. It was an underdog story. By most accounts, it was expected that Christianity would be destroyed by the Roman Empire, like so many other small cults and even nations had been in the past. But Christianity survives. Even when things were dark, God was still there. God was still protecting the people. He found a way. And isn't that a reflection of God? Isn't that something we've seen all throughout history so far? Go back and look at the Israelites. God never abandoned them. Just like God never abandoned the Christians in the Roman Empire. And God will never abandon us. He can take our most terrible, dark circumstances and use them for good. It's God's plan. And while we don't always fully understand that plan, we can trust that there is a plan because history shows that to us. And we can even see that later on as the church continues to divide and argue about earthly things. The church will continue to be under attack as it continues to try to find its identity in an ever-changing world and in a world in which it is truly the major power. But that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.